when we urge men to live out a biblical worldview, we're not imposing something alien on them.
Yeah.
It fits their own intrinsic, innate understanding of what it means to be a good man.
Welcome to the Engaged Truth Show. I'm your host, Caleb Harrelson. And on this show, we engage with claims, objections to Christianity, and popular critiques. And we make the case that Christianity is total truth for all of reality. And if you're wondering, if you've been watching or listening to the show for a while, where that catchphrase comes from of total truth, well, that comes from Nancy Pearcey's book you may see behind me. And I'm so excited to have Professor Pearcey with us today. Her latest book is The Toxic War on Masculinity. And it's about how Christianity reconciles the sexes. Her earlier books include Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and two ECPA Gold Medallion Award winners, How Now Shall We Live. And of course, her book, Total Truth, as I mentioned. Her books have been translated into 19 languages. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University, a former agnostic. Pearcey has spoken at universities such as Princeton, Stanford, USC, and Dartmouth. She has been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the top 5 women apologists by Christianity Today, and held in the Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. We are so glad to have you on the show today, Nancy. Welcome to the Engaged Truth Show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, let's get right into it. Now, your new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, I've just been working through it a second time, and I was saying just yesterday, it gets better every time, because I think there's just so much meat in here, and I just want to thank you for the hard work of how you've woven together the history and given practical solutions as well. One of the things you talk through here in the beginning of the book is you talk about how really a lot of articles have been written of how masculinity itself is toxic, particularly biblical masculinity. But I love how you lay out at the beginning how there's the good news is that's a good place to start, is people accuse evangelical Christian men of being oppressive patriarchs prone to abuse. But you make the surprising claim that they test out as having the lowest levels of abuse and divorce. Can you explain that some more?
Yeah, I was really glad to put that at the beginning of the book because I wanted people to read the good news first. And so you're right that many people accuse evangelical men of sort of being exhibit A of toxic masculinity. It was very easy for me to find examples, but I will give you just one. So this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which was a follow-up to the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So that's pretty strong language. And what happened is the social scientists, so like psychologists, sociologists, were reading these accusations and saying, well, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And in my book, I quote some dozen studies or so that all found that the media narrative is wrong. It's completely wrong, that evangelical men actually test out as the best in terms of being the most loving husbands and fathers. And by the way, one of the first pushbacks I get is, of course, the women said they were happy, their husband's sitting right there. But that was not the case. Actually, most of these surveys draw from large objective databases, like the largest one is called the General Social Survey. It's done by the University of Chicago. And it's data that is used by policymakers, journalists, social scientists, and others. So yeah, the women were interviewed separately. And so what they're really saying is that the women reported the highest level of happiness with their husbands' expressions of love and affection. Evangelical fathers tested out as the most engaged with their children, both in terms of shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in terms of discipline like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples have the lowest rates of divorce of any group in America, 35% lower than secular men. And the real shocker is they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence. And even Christians don't know this, right? So I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this material. And that's why I wanted to get it out. I wanted to get it out where churches can start encouraging Christian men, because Christian men also feel the general denigration or attack on masculinity. When I told my class at Houston Christian University, where I teach, that I was writing a book on masculinity, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Oh, wow.
So I thought, okay, even Christians need this. And here's another story from one of my graduate students. She's the leader of a women's ministry at a large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out flowers and tell the mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. So I thought, okay, this is why they need to know this material, first, so that they can be more supportive of men, and and how we can also counter, in the public square. You're very interested in apologetics, as I am, and one of the reasons I wrote the book is to ask, why does the secular culture get masculinity so wrong, and how can we counter it? And what I just told you was not some pep talk from a religious leader. It's solid empirical research. It's evidence-based findings showing that Christian men do, in fact, break out of the stereotypes. And so we should be bold in bringing it into the public square as well.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate what you said about how we should be bold and bringing that into the public square, because I think that is part of our job as communicators. Just like in the early church, I really like early church history, and you see Aristides and Justin Martyr and guys talking about, look at the way we live our lives. That was part of their apologetic. And in a large way, you're saying, look at the way real faithful Christian men love and serve their wives. That's part of their apologetic to the world. Yet I really appreciate the distinction you made between the nominal Christian and the faithful Christian, because you shared some of the stats earlier about the faithful husband. But then I think part of the problem is there's not that differentiation being made between those who are nominal in name. So can you explain some more what's going on with those who seem to be lumped into that category that really don't fit this faithful, loving husband category?
Yeah, so this comes out of the pushback I always get is, haven't we heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the society? In fact, in my research, I found that's one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders.
Wow.
And so what happened is the researchers went back to the data, and they made that important distinction that you just mentioned. They pulled out men who are very authentic in their faith, go to church regularly, and so on, from merely nominal Christians. And my students don't even know what the word nominal means. So I have to explain to them, NOM is Latin for name. So it means in name only. So these are men who, in a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, for example, but who don't attend church. It's family background. They're cultural Christians. And these men test out shockingly different. These men fit all the toxic stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They are the least engaged with their children. They divorce at a higher rate than even the secular world, 20% higher. And then the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than secular men. So this is why the numbers get so skewed. If somebody does a study on evangelicals, they're going to capture men who are, better than secular men who are worse than secular men. And so, of course, the numbers are going to be misleading. And so it also suggests, the church has a real job to do here. How can they, on the one hand, really support the Christian men who are doing well and encourage them and stop scolding them? Like my graduate student said, stop scolding them. I tried very hard not to have a scolding tone in this book. But on the other hand, how can churches reach out then to these nominal Christian men who are identifying as evangelical, but who are living actually worse than secular men? How are we going to reach out to them and disciple them better? Basically, what they're doing is they're taking language like headship and submission, but they're not true Christians. They're not hanging around the church enough to get the biblical meaning of those terms. So instead, they're importing secular definitions into those terms and identifying headship in terms of the secular script for masculinity, like, dominance, control, oppressiveness, and so on. So that's kind of what the task before the church is now, based on these findings. Is, how can we reach out and do a good job with these very, very divergent groups of men?
Absolutely, and that's so helpful and clarifying, I think, for our readers and listeners and viewers, because uh, I've heard so many of my friends that I grew up with and online, they're just so quick to castigate those who would hold to a biblical view of marriage and masculinity. And I think this differentiation matters. That we can see that they're not understanding the true meaning of when we're even looking at headship. And you talk some in your book about, well, what are the stats actually saying? Those who actually embrace a complementarianism are the women saying, or the wives saying, this is abusive inherently, or is it a misunderstanding of the model?
Well, one of the things that's unique about this book is that it's very fact-based. It's the most fact-based book that I've ever written, and I wanted to counter the charge that Christian men, are the most abusive and tyrannical patriarchs, um, by looking at both at the studies and at surveys and hearing what they actually say. So there were also surveys where they just asked Christian men and women, what do you think headship means, and how do you live it out in your life? I didn't want to ask what the leaders say, what the theologians say. I wanted to see, how is it actually worked out in practice, to answer people like your friends. And I was blown away. I was actually quite surprised. I did not expect Christian men to express headship in such a loving, mutual, respectful way. So, for example, they did not tend to define it in terms of the final authority, the decision maker, the tiebreaker. Some of the common phrases that we hear, they defined it in terms of spiritual leadership. That was the most common phrase. And by the way, the most frequently quoted Bible verse was Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. Later, I have some chapters on abuse, and there I quote people saying, I never even heard a sermon on that. In fact, I didn't even know it was in the Bible. People who are abusive have not really absorbed that verse. But in the chapter on how committed Christians live it out, they quoted it every time.
Mm.
And then they would ask, okay, well, what do you mean by spiritual leadership? And they said, of course, the sort of practical things, like get your family to church on Sunday, get your kids to youth group, have family devotions, family Bible reading and prayer. And then also, though, I thought this was interesting, the sort of intangibles, like just feeling responsible for the spiritual growth of your children, being responsible for the spiritual welfare of your wife, leading your family in the sense, in the sense of just being loving and supportive and leading them. And you will like this also, training your kids in how to stand up in a secular worldview, to a secular worldview, because, they're going to be surrounded by secular ideas much of their life. How can they be courageous and bold and also present a reasonable defense of their faith? So apologetics got in there as well, because that's also part of the father's leadership. Is he equipping his children to function in an increasingly secular society? So I thought that was really great, that when you ask Christian men what they think headship means, they describe it in these sort of both nurturing and leadership kind of language.
That's so awesome, and that's really helpful, as we think about, well, here's what the claims are, but here's what it really looks like. Those who believe this, what that looks like fleshed out in their life. And I know you learned some under Francis Schaeffer, with at Labrie, and it's been fascinating to me reading about that over the years and learning from Schaeffer. Many of us still read his works, and I love one of his quotes that said something to the effect, if I remember it right, that love is one of our greatest apologetics. And I think that's very true. As of course we should make the case, written and spoken, to others and in conversation. But it's so important that people can come into our lives and observe how we love and serve each other, and those who would hold to biblical masculinity and biblical view of marriage. I think that's so effective. But I think you hit on something that was interesting as well, of um, that there is some who may have absorbed these scripts. You talk about the secular script a lot in your book, about the secular script of masculinity. And I think part of why we see Christians competing with this, where um, I know when I was growing up, I'd read different books by Christian authors, maybe well intended, but I kind of got the sense that I need to go out into the wilderness to really rediscover my manhood, and then read scripture out there. And then, and it was sometimes confusing because I'm like, well, what does that look like? I just go like be a tour guide in the forest, or and then learn scripture out there, and how, I mean, and so you trace this history of where this script rose, this secular script, to dominance. So maybe you can kind of unpack where did we go off in this biblical masculinity, and I know some of that is pre-industrial, so maybe you could take us back to that time period.
Yeah, good. So a lot of people think the concept of toxic masculinity maybe arose in the 1960s, the second wave feminism. And
Yeah.
no, you have to go much further back. So before the Industrial Revolution, men worked with their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men was much more of a caretaking ethos, responsibility for his family. Most of the child-rearing books back then, sermons, advice manuals, were addressed to fathers. If you go today into a bookstore, they're mostly addressed to mothers. But back then, fathers were considered the primary parent, and they did spend as much time with their children as mothers did. And of course, they're also making their way in a wilderness. So the more traditional masculine virtues were also praised, of resilience and courage and mastery and so on. But it was for the sake of the family. It was not defined in terms of individual advancement. That changed with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution takes work out of the home, and men have to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, men are not working alongside people they love and have a moral bond with. Instead, they're working as an individual in competition with other men. And that's when you see the literature start to change. You could actually see it in the language people began to use. They began to protest that men were becoming egocentric, self-centered, get ahead, make it at all costs, look out for number one, greedy and acquisitive. This was the actual language that they used. And at the same time, of course, culture was secularizing about that time as well, 19th century. And so they also protested that men were losing their commitment to a Christian ethic, right? Men were going to church less often. They were acting out a secular script in the workplace. Many of them had the sacred secular split, right? They began to live by a secular script in the workplace and then come home and try to be a Christian at home. That sacred secular split was a big part of the early industrialization. So it was in the 19th century then that you first start seeing negative language describing the male character. And so if we want to counter it, we have to think, okay, what happened? Fathers got separated from their families. So, is there a way to address that? Is there a way to fix that today? So I do have a whole chapter on, can we flex the workplace? And really the pandemic was a game changer because a lot of people found out that they like being home more. The New York Times, this is not in the article, this is not in the book because it came out more recently. But the New York Times just had an article titled something like, "During the pandemic, fathers got closer to their children and they don't want to lose that."
Mm.
So I have a whole chapter where I encourage people to maybe think creatively about, can we at least flex the workplace some to allow fathers to have more time with their kids?
Yeah, that's, I think, so helpful when we think about the pandemic, as there was a lot of problems that came out of that, no doubt, but the Lord redeemed that to give us a bit of a window of what can it look like when we have this presence in our family's life, our wife's life, our children's life. And at home because we were forced to be. But it also it reminded us, okay, there is some history which we can't go to back to the pre-industrial time period, but I think you connected that well near the end of the book, after tracing some of the history where you have the fathers now, or the pre-industrial time, where you would say that it was this term you use I thought was really interesting, where it talks about how they were disinterested in their own pursuit. Can you explain that some more? What does it mean for a father to be disinterested? At first it sounds like, wait a minute, what? But it was it was a good thing though for the family.
Yeah, it doesn't mean not interested.
Yeah.
It means not pursuing your own interest. So in the
Mm,
colonial era, there was a very distinctive definition of authority. So when you talked about a man having authority in his family, what they meant by authority was the person who's responsible for the common good. So, I look out for what's good for me, you look out for what's good for you. But who looks out for the common good of the marriage relationship or of the family, the church, civil society, and so on? And that was the person in authority was the one responsible for the common good. And so the favorite word of the day was that he was supposed to be disinterested in the sense of not pursuing his own personal interest. Everyone else could, but he wasn't. He was not supposed to pursue his own interest because he had responsibility for the whole. And unfortunately, we did lose that concept of authority. I don't know that anyone really today would hold that view. And I show how it's partly the product of a shift in political philosophy,
mm,
because prior to the Industrial Revolution, um, the political philosophy of the day was very much sort of organic, right? So a family was an organic structure that was greater than the sum of the parts, right? It's not just an aggregate of individuals. There's something larger involved. Here's how we sometimes think of it. When people are in a relationship, a man and a woman, they will sometimes say, there's me and there's you and there's our relationship. Sometimes they say we need to work on our relationship. They sense that the relationship is a third entity, in addition to the two individuals involved. So we sense that there's a larger whole. And that's what they meant by the common good. What was good for the relationship was the common good. And of course, usually in colonial era, the person in authority who had responsibility for the common good was usually the man. After the Industrial Revolution, a new political philosophy became more common in America. It was called social contract theory, and it was the idea that there are no organic social institutions like marriage or family or church, but all of these are just aggregates of individuals. People come together because they have a common interest, and but as a result, there is no common good.
mm.
And in that case, there's no common good for men to be responsible for. And so I trace this as one of the key stages in the secularization of the masculine script, because it was basically letting men off the hook, right? It's basically saying, well, there's no common good, so men are no longer responsible for the common good. And so that's one of the key stages in which American society was essentially reducing its moral and ethical expectations of men.
And would you say that's in large part due to the two-story view of reality and truth? And maybe first you can explain, what is the two-story view of truth?
Yeah, so and you mentioned Francis Schaeffer because he's the one who first sort of popularized this
Right.
among evangelicals, and he was concerned about it because of the role it plays in evangelism and apologetics. It used to be um, the nutshell. Here's the nutshell description. Most cultures believe there's a natural order and a moral spiritual order, and they think that they are integrated into one cosmic order, right? One cosmic whole. And therefore, truth about the cosmos will also be a single, integrated, internally coherent whole. But after the scientific revolution, many people in the West began to say, no, the only reliable form of knowledge we have is science, empirically testable facts. What happens then to moral and spiritual truths? Well, many people decided they didn't qualify as truths. They were merely personal preference, personal feelings. And so Schaeffer used the metaphor, and actually many philosophers use this metaphor, It's just that we learned it from Schaeffer first. He used a metaphor of 2 stories in a building, so he made this little diagram. And he said in the lowest stories where you put science and facts or rationality, and these are truths that are universal. These are public truths. These are the truths that are supposed to run our public life. And then the upper story becomes the place where people throw morality, spirituality, purpose, meaning, beauty. And these have been reduced to merely personal preference. And so in secular academia, the shorthand way of talking about this is the fact value split, with facts in the lower story and personal values in the upper story. And what's fascinating is, of course, these aren't just ideas. They get, fleshed out, incarnated in our society. So after the Industrial Revolution, they developed a very large public realm, right? So factories, businesses, financial institutions, universities, the state. And people began to argue, well, the public square should operate by scientific principles. And again, what they meant was value free. Values don't belong in the public arena. And that's what we hear today, right? Don't bring your private values into the public realm. So
Right.
This is when that started. And so, if values are kicked out of the public realm, where would they be cultivated? In the private realm. And who presides in the private realm still, at that time was women. So it was fascinating the way these kind of dualisms permeated society. Not only was it a view of truth, a split view of truth, facts versus values, but then it became incorporated into public versus private, and even into men versus women, because men were working in that secular sphere, getting that secular education. They were becoming secular earlier than women did. And so in a sense, in the 19th century, for the first time ever, you see women held up as the moral guardians of society. So it's the fact value split ends up explaining a lot of our history and even the structure of our society. So I'm glad you asked about that, because it's so significant. And I try to get all Christians in my classes. I try to get them, you can't leave this classroom until you really understand that fact value split.
That's awesome. And well, I started a Worldview Academy, and our students are reading your Finding Truth book. And we talk about, where we're going to be talking more and more this semester about the fact value and the 2-story view of reality. And would you also say, as it relates to this 2-story view, that this is part of the reason why it's still, we look at the numbers of those who attend church. It's you said in your book, it's predominantly women that attend church. And there was a book, I remember, I haven't read it. I think you mentioned it in your book, Why Men Hate Church. And now, is that part of it? Is it the 2-story view of reality? Is it that and some other issues as well?
Oh, yes, it is. Now, I would say that Christianity has always been especially attractive to women. In the early church, there were also more women than men. And the reason was that they had so much greater status and dignity and respect in the Christian church than they had in the surrounding Roman culture. Ancient Rome had very low view of women. For example, they practiced infanticide and abortion, and it was mostly baby girls. So it was very rare for a Roman family to have more than just one token daughter. And of course, abortion back then killed a lot of these women as well. And the sexual ethic, you hardly want to call it an ethic at all. But Roman men were it was considered totally socially acceptable for men to have sex with just about anyone they wanted to, with prostitutes and mistresses and courtesans. But most of all, they're slaves. Most adultery took place with slaves, and both men and women, both children and adults. So homosexuality was rampant in the ancient world as well. In fact, it's not in this book. It's my earlier book, Love Thy Body. I actually quote a Roman writer who was admonishing a Roman woman, a wife, and saying, don't be jealous when your husband prefers to have sex with a slave boy, because you know that sex with boys is more pleasurable. So that's what women were up against. They had an incredible amount of competition for the husband's attention and affection. In the church, they didn't. In the Christian church, it was, every man has one woman, and he has to be chaste outside of, he has to be faithful in marriage, chaste outside of marriage. And so it greatly raised the status of both marriage and women. But what you're talking about, so I want us to keep that history in mind.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
But there was also, during the First and Second Great Awakenings, in America, Christianity became more emotional. And the Great Awakenings, back then there weren't a lot of intellectual objections to Christianity. There were not a lot of atheists at that time. And so the awakenings were not geared towards answering atheists. The awakenings were geared towards reviving the faith of nominal Christians, and making them more fervent and more committed. So you can see that, it kind of made sense that they tended to focus on emotional preaching, revving people up emotionally. Well, the problem with that, though, is that women were thought to be more emotional, and therefore it made people think that religion was really for women and children.
Mm.
And so, and we still have, have that heritage behind us too, that, I mean, you still find people who say, yeah, religion's fine for women and children. And in fact, the average US congregation is 60% female and 40% male. And more women than men go to Sunday school, small groups. More women than men shop at Christian stores, listen to Christian radio. And that actually exacerbates the problem, because then both the pastors and the marketers all try to gear their products towards women. And so, it becomes kind of a vicious cycle. And I like that book that you mentioned, why it's actually called Why Men Hate Going to Church.
Oh, okay.
That's an important verb in there, right? They don't hate church necessarily, but they do hate going to church.
Yeah.
Because they often feel like the church is too feminized. And he has a really good, the author is David Murrow, and he has a really good website called Church for Men, in which he gives suggestions on how to make church more masculine friendly. And some of it's fairly simple, things that people can do, like don't use pastel colors, have the decor a little bit more manly, don't have Kleenex boxes at the end of the pew, and think about changing some of the songs, the very emotional, subjective praise courses. Men do kind of prefer maybe some of the more traditional hymns, like A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, right? Which is, praising God for his strength and his honoring God. It's a different mentality. So if you're interested, check out Church for Men. But I do think, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to find ways to attract more men.
Yeah, I agree. Now, it's interesting. I was just reviewing, I think, last night, your section in your book where you talk about it's almost this overcorrection of the feminization of church, where you talked about this muscular Christianity response in recent church history. Can you explain that some more?
Yeah, let me give you the historical context. So after the Industrial Revolution, a lot of men, for the first time, were working at sedentary jobs, right? Office jobs. And they were no longer working out on the farm and doing hard physical labor. And people began to be concerned that men were growing soft. A new word entered the English vocabulary. It was over-civilized. People began to be concerned that men were growing soft and effeminate and, falling prey to the vices that were more common in the city, like brothels and drinking and fighting and gambling. In fact, let me give you one quote on this. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. Wow. So there was a reason there was a temperance movement. But people were concerned that men were no longer growing up, with that tough physical hardiness of a farm boy. And so they began to encourage men to be more manly. This is when sports became common in America. People didn't have sports leagues before that. Basketball started. By the way, basketball was invented by a Presbyterian pastor. Did you know that?
Wow, I did not. That's awesome.
He was trying to figure out a sport that men could do during the winter, when they can't do soccer or baseball. And so he took 2 baskets that were sitting around that had been used for collecting peaches, and he put them up and invented basketball.
Nice. That's awesome.
But it was the first time that soccer leagues and boxing leagues and all kinds of sports grew up in that period, because they were saying, how can we toughen up men? And it was also a period where male fiction writers began to write books on how we need to get out into the wild, out into the wilderness, which is what you just mentioned. You need to go become all of the main characters were cowboys or frontiersmen or scouts or sailors, people who got away from civilization to discover their true masculinity, get tough, be wild, be fierce. And that was a trend in the male fiction writing of the time. So how's the church fit into all of this? Well, the church is looking around and they're concerned about over-civilization too. And so they start a movement called muscular Christianity. And they tried to get a message out that Christianity was not, feminizing, that Christianity was a tough masculine thing. And I have lots of quotes from pastors at the time. And by the way, to give you another label, this was also during the fundamentalist era, roughly. And so I have a lot of fundamentalist pastors saying things like, to be a Christian is a manly thing to do. To be in the pulpit, you have to have courage. Only a man can be in the pulpit because he has courage. And Billy Sunday was, one of the best known preachers at the time, who was a former baseball player. And he used to say in his crusades, he did evangelistic crusades. And in his crusades, if guys were not coming down to the front, he would say, oh, if you don't come down to the front and give your life to Jesus, you're not manly enough. You're not manly enough to be a Christian. Only real men are Christians. And so in a way, again, that was not a bad thing. It was good to encourage men. But they kind of overcorrected and began to say that women are actually inferior. And so they took women off their Victorian pedestal and began to say that women are spiritually and intellectually inferior. So they put them sort of on a lower rung. And I have some quotes. There was a quote from one fundamentalist leader who was speaking to seminary students, and he said, you need to suppress your wife's ambition and quiet her tongue. And so, and many of the fundamentalist organizations began to shut women out of public ministry. So in the First and Second Great Awakenings, women had a lot of public ministry. They were not typically ordained, but they could speak to mixed audiences. That's what it was called, meaning they could speak to both men and women. They weren't called preachers so much as exhorters. That was their word for it. But they basically it was preaching. That they were not ordained, so they were exhorters. They were missionaries. They were Sunday school teachers. They were heads of Sunday school organizations. They were heads of Christian schools. There was public ministry. They were almost numerically, equal to men in the number of women, and they were even pastors, especially in rural areas where men didn't want to go because it was a small church that wouldn't pay enough. And so these non-ordained women would go out and be pastors. And so, but with the fundamentalist era, they shut down a lot of these opportunities for women and began to say women are not capable of doing these things, having public ministry. Women should focus on their families, to coin a phrase. And the only scope for them is domestic duties. So I think that was a bit of an overcorrection, and it did spawn the Christian feminist movement, right? Because women started reacting against that. So perhaps the major heritage we have from that era is now we have a Christian feminist movement that whatever you think of it, good or bad, it happened because the fundamentalists sort of worked towards suppressing women in a way that they had not been suppressed before by the church.
Yeah, and that's interesting, especially because you differentiated between that fundamentalist response compared to originally it was just the defense of the essentials of Christianity. And then it seems they're they didn't know how to well, they should have had the tools if they understood some history and of the valuable role of both men and women in marriage and in ministry, um, and understanding a proper view of headship and not devaluing women at the same time. But do you think some of that is related to um, well, I remember you mentioning like Jack London and some other authors who talk about this go to the wild, but there was almost this assumption, it seemed very Darwinian, that you can go back to your evolutionary roots to really discover your true identity. So I don't know if that's part of some Christians absorbing some of those assumptions, but not realizing maybe that's a little bit of it, or there's something else you would say to that as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because actually that's one of my favorite chapters, the chapter on the impact of Darwinism, because most people don't know that. I mean, when they hear Darwinian evolution, they think of fossils and genes and so on. But they don't know what a huge impact Darwinian theory had on concepts of masculinity. So Darwinian thinkers began to write that in the struggle for survival, the men who came out on top would, by necessity, be those who were rugged, ruthless, brutal, barbarian, savage, and even predatory. And that's the language that they used. And so, whereas Christianity had urged men to live up to the image of God in them, Darwinian thinkers began to urge them to live down to their animal nature, to the beast within. That was their favorite phrase, the beast within. And reconnect with the biological instincts for lust and power. So, and then you ask, well, how would women, get along with such brutal men? And
Right.
one of the person who was the major popularizer of Darwinism here in America was Herbert Spencer. He was a sociologist, and he actually addressed this. He said, well, to get along with such brutal barbarian men, women had to learn the ability to please. And then he went on and said, it would also help if they learned how to hide their resentment at such poor treatment. So
Wow.
this was the message of evolution, apparently, that men were at heart, brutal beasts, and women had to learn to placate them and hide their resentment at being treated so badly. And you're right. When you mentioned Jack London, so Jack London was a part of a movement called literary naturalism.
Hmm.
So Darwinism helped support naturalism in the sciences, and then there were these literary authors who tried to portray a naturalistic worldview in their fiction. And the best one being Jack London. He was intentionally writing to convey a Darwinian worldview. And so, he wrote about dogs, but of course they
Yeah.
were metaphors for humans. And he did think that humans were products of natural selection, genes and environment, with no real free will. But the naturalists, like you said, did tend to emphasize getting out into the wild, getting in touch with the animal nature. I even have Tarzan in, though he's more of a popular writer,
Yeah.
but that's when his books were written. And his son, the son of the author, says explicitly that they were written to convey a Darwinian worldview, that humans are nothing, beyond the animals. So Tarzan retains his inner wildness because, he's been raised by the apes. And even after he learns European customs and languages, at the end, he turns to Jane and says, I am still a wild beast at heart.
Hmm.
And so that was the message of evolution. And did Christians pick up on that? Yes, you are absolutely right. A lot of Christians picked up on that language, often not realizing that, wait a minute, I'm just taking late 19th century secular ideas, and putting a Christian veneer over them. So I thought that was a really good catch on your part.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think that's really helpful as well, seeing that we just Christianized those assumptions of the secular script. And I know you talked about I think in that same chapter where, well, instead of thinking that this is going back to your roots of what it means to be a man and using Christian verses sprinkled on with that, you said there's a better script for that. And you talked about a lot about, and all throughout the book, about how the man can go and serve his family. You don't have to go into the wild. Not that that's bad. Like, I love hiking. So I'm going to do that, but I'm going to frame it in a different way than those assumptions were from that secular script. So maybe you can talk some more on that. Instead of that being your foundational starting point of rediscovering what it means to be a man, what is the biblical script on that instead?
Yes, you're right. Several times in the book, I come back to the cultural mandate.
Yes.
And by the way, my students don't always know what that word even means, but it's in Genesis 1, so it's pre-fall. That's important. This is the original job description that God gave the human race. God has set the stage, right? He's created the heavens and the earth. He's created the animals and plants. And then he creates the first humans. And what is the first thing he says to them? He tells them why he created them. Here's your job description. Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And in the highly streamlined language of Genesis, be fruitful and multiply doesn't just mean have kids. It means all of the social institutions that historically grow out of the family, right? Because you get the extended family, the tribe, the village, the nation, and you also get social institutions for particular purposes, like the village needs a school, it needs a church, it needs a government, it needs a marketplace. So it really means you build the entire social world. Subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So, of course, most civilizations start with agriculture, but it includes mining, it includes technology, it includes inventing computers, it includes even composing music. So I said this in my class one day, and a student said, well, what? Come on, composing music? And I play the violin. So I said, what's the violin made out of? Well, wood. What's the bow made out of? Horsehair. So all of the transcendent beauty that we associate with music starts with harnessing the raw materials of nature.
Yeah.
And so this verse has come to be called the cultural mandate, meaning that God has given humans the mandate, the command to create civilizations, create cultures, create history. And so what I do throughout the book is I call men back to the cultural mandate, because that's really where I think they get their truest understanding of their masculine identity and purpose, is to roll up their sleeves, not escape into the wild. You do see books implying that, whitewater rafting and climbing mountains and shooting elk with a bow, that's how you discover your true masculinity. Get away from women, get away from family, get away from civilization. Those are all secular themes from the 19th century. I think the more biblical view is, let's look at the cultural mandate. Roll up your sleeves and invest deeply, first in your family, then in other social institutions, and invest deeply in doing creative, productive work that glorifies God and helps your fellow creatures. So I think that that's a much richer, a much fuller understanding of what men are called to do.
Absolutely. And I think that's so helpful to frame it up within the cultural mandate, and how you've talked about between creation, fall, and redemption, part of God's work of, we're saved through grace and faith in Christ so that no one can boast. But then we're saved. We have this new identity that wants to glorify God in all areas. And that's part of understanding the total truth of the biblical worldview.
Yeah, and that's an important, for anything, but for masculinity too. You could apply
Yeah.
that. You could apply creation, fall, redemption to anything. So creation means figuring out what was the first job description, what were men created to do.
Mhm.
And by the way, sheer physical facts also fit there, because God made us physical creatures. So one of the things I had to put in front of the book, and people always would ask me, well, what do you think are the differences between men and women then? And I start by saying, well, of course, we're more similar than we are different. If you map most character traits, the men will form a bell curve, women will form a bell curve, and they will overlap quite closely. Even on traits like aggression, that one surprised me. They overlap pretty closely. They differ mostly at the extremes, which is why 95% of people in prison are male. They're from that extreme, right? But then you look at the physical side. Nobody can dispute the fact that men are bigger, stronger, faster. They have 75% more muscle mass, but 90% greater upper body strength. They have more fast twitch muscles. I had to learn that word. It means they can react more quickly. And of course, testosterone makes men more aggressive and more risk-taking. And these are all good traits. This is basic starting material. Clearly, this is part of creation. This is how God made men. And so we need to start by affirming these as good. And I have literally read some feminists who say, well, if women would just work out, they could be as strong as men. Actually, no, that's biologically impossible. A few athletes might be better than the average man.
Yeah.
But as a whole, of course. And basically, by the time I get to the end of the book, I show how important that is. I was on a podcast a few days ago, Caleb, you'll appreciate this. So with a Christian who said, well, apart from the physical things, what are the differences? Apart from the physical things, that's huge.
Yeah.
People think, well, there's a few physical bits. No, wait till you get to the chapters on abuse. I have 2 chapters on abuse. Any woman who's been physically abused is extremely aware of the physical differences between men and women, because if there is abuse, who ends up in the hospital or even killed, it's almost all women. And in fact, half of all female homicides, this was a shock, half of all female homicides, that murders, are intimate partners. That's husband, former husband, boyfriend, former boyfriend. The comparable statistic for men is 3%.
Wow.
So yeah. So all that to say, we should value and honor the way God has made men. Their physical strength is given them for a reason, and we should also. This is the creation fall part. This is how they were created, but because of the fall, they can misuse it. And so then redemption is, how do we help direct men to a bit more biblical view of masculinity, to use their strengths in a positive way, maybe like, for example, like the colonial era, where men were very much expected to use their masculine strength, not for themselves, but in responsibility for their family and their community. By the way, they were expected to be, this was a phrase at the time, you were expected to be a father of the community. I thought that was cool. They were not supposed to be just, homebodies, but their fathering abilities were also for the benefit of the whole community.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating, very helpful. And I remember reading how the issue of the women vote was connected with being the head of the family unit, and that you said that women actually opposed it originally. Is that correct? The women vote?
Yeah, so I get a lot of skepticism on this one.
Yeah.
So I had to find the actual quotes. Feminist leaders at the time, like Susan B. Anthony, specifically said the main opposition to women having the vote is coming from women, and then I had to get quotes from the anti-suffragists proving that. So many of them said things like, they didn't frame it as men's vote versus women's vote. They framed it as the household vote versus the individual vote. And what these women were saying is, we want the household vote. We want to retain the household vote. Why? Because it was a way of society saying men don't just speak for themselves. They speak for the whole household. They are morally required to take the interest of their wives and children, and actually others too, like they had servants and so on back then as well, extended family. They were expected to take the interest of the entire household into account. And women were afraid that if you move to an individual vote, that men will be, in a sense, let off the hook. They will no longer be held responsible for everyone else's interest. And that is what happened, in fact. I used the vote as an example of a shift in political philosophy, because I'm not really arguing whether women should have the vote today, obviously. But it was illustrative of a shift. So before the Industrial Revolution, like I said earlier, people had an organic understanding of social institutions, so that there was a common good of the marriage, of the family, and so on. And the man was responsible for the common good. Roughly after the American Revolution, we began to shift to a different political philosophy called social contract theory, which said social institutions are just aggregates of individuals who come together because they share a common interest. But there's no common good, and therefore men cannot be held responsible for the common good. Well, the anti-suffragists saw, well, that's reducing cultural and ethical expectations of men. Now, and that's why they opposed it, because this was an important step in the secularizing of the script for masculinity. Reducing social expectations. I mean, people tend to rise or fall to the expectations placed on them, and this was a definite decrease in the moral expectations placed on men. Now, eventually, women did get behind the vote, but here's why: because it was framed differently.
Yeah.
The early feminists had framed it in terms of autonomy and individual rights, and most women didn't resonate with that. They resonated with the household, the family as an organic unit. But eventually, the vote was reframed as a way of protecting the family, and the most influential woman of the entire 19th century was Frances Willard. She was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she reframed the vote as the ballot for home protection. And what she meant by that was women have little recourse when their husbands are drinking. They come home, drink, and they beat the wives and children. And so she said, the vote will help women pass temperance laws. That was her goal. We can pass laws to get men drinking less. And so in that way, it will help protect the family. So this whole history, most of us have no clue that the vote meant, hey, here's a way we can protect women and family. And that's when women got behind the vote. And that's when it passed, is when women began to say, okay, fine, yeah, good. Women do need a public voice to protect the family.
Wow. That's so helpful. And I think everyone's really going to benefit not only from your explanation here, but hopefully they'll dive into to buy the book on Amazon or any of the major book distributors. There's one question I wanted to ask. You mentioned some about the early church and why Christianity was so attractive for women. Yet it did take some time to take root, the Christian sexual ethic, if you will. Now, I guess my question would be, do you see some similarities between the early Christianity and today? If we're in a similar perspective or approach that we need to do, like the early church, with how we need to continue communicating biblical morality?
Yeah, that's a good question. By the way, the early church, when I said it took a while for the biblical ethic to really permeate people's consciousness, was Augustine was still admonishing husbands that they could not have sex with their slaves. 4th century, that it was so ingrained in their culture that, slaves are fair game. If you're the head of the household, those slaves are, sexually speaking, fair game. And it took a while. Most people don't realize that,
Wow.
They think, okay, the early church came in with this biblical sex ethic and it totally transformed society. Well, it did, but it took a while. I think what we're up against now is that, yes, again, men, even Christian men, are picking up the secular idea of sexuality. And here's how. We back up a little bit. When I said that the public realm became secularized and the private values were kicked out of the public realm and assigned to the private realm, and then women were seen then as the moral guardians of society.
Right.
So the 19th century then did have a large increase in typical male vices like drinking, gambling, alcoholism, and so on. And in response to that, there emerged a whole host of reform movements. The temperance movement, the abolition movement against slavery, the what was called the social purity movement, which was against prostitution and sex trafficking. There's a whole slew of reform movements, but they were mostly driven by women, and they were mostly condemnations of males. One of my favorite historians puts it this way. She says that, first of all, she says most of the reform movements were condemnations of males. There was little doubt as to the sex of the tavern keeper, the slave master, the drunkard, and the seducer. And so that did create a kind of tension between the sexes, because then women were seen as morally superior, and it was their job to tame men, like to civilize men. Well, I was on a podcast with a young Christian couple, by the way. And so I turned it back on them. I asked them some questions. And I asked, do you think that that double standard is still there? And they said, oh, absolutely. They sensed that in the Christian church today that there's still a strong sense that men are more naturally prone to sin and vice. Men are just naturally going to do porn. Men are naturally more prone to adultery. And that it's up to the women to hold them in check. It's up to the women to establish the moral boundaries in dating, especially, right? The woman's supposed to draw the line on physical involvement. So I thought, well, there it is. Yes, we're apparently, and by the way, I have a 26-year-old son too, and he picked this up going to he attended the school where I teach, Houston Christian Baptist. And he said, very much in Christian circles, it just assumed that men are more sinful, more prone to vice, more, they're I'll refer to a recent news tabloid just came out. It's in Australia. It showed a picture of an 8-year-old boy, and it said, "Parents, how will you prevent this boy from becoming a monster?"
Wow.
How can we intervene now to keep him from becoming toxic? Okay. My son attending a Christian school felt like that was kind of the message still, even in Christian circles. And he hated it because he's a very gentle person, He's not a typical sort of masculine jock type. And he felt like the expectations in Christian circles was still focused, shaped a lot by the secular script. And, you didn't ask me this, so let me just jump in and suggest it. One of the things that I put right at the front of the book was a fascinating survey done by a sociologist that kind of highlights what we're talking about. He gets invited to speak all around the world, and so he came up with a really interesting survey where he asked young men 2 questions. First one was, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? And the sociologist said all around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that. Duty, sacrifice, honor, integrity, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And the sociologist would say, where'd you learn that? They'd say, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western nation, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with the second question. What does it mean if I say, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be strong, be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid. That's their language. And so even this non-Christian sociologist was able to see that all around the globe, it's universal. Men do have an innate, inherent sense of what it means to be the good man. As we would say, they're made in God's image. Or this is just general revelation. Men sense that their unique masculine strength was not given them to just get whatever they want, but to provide, protect, take care of those that they love. But they also are feeling the pressure of a cultural script, which is maybe what we might consider more toxic, at least if decoupled from a moral ideal. Those are the traits that can slide into dominance and entitlement, control, and so on. And so I thought that was fascinating because it does help us. It helps us as Christians say, okay, the good man lines up with the biblical view of manhood. Great. And what it means, by the way, since you're into apologetics, when we urge men to live out a biblical worldview, we're not imposing something alien on them.
Yeah.
It fits their own intrinsic, innate understanding of what it means to be a good man. But it also helps us to put kind of a finger on where are the Andrew Tates of the world coming from?
Yeah.
What's the secular view of the quote unquote real man? And so when I was writing this book, it was more controversial book than any book I've ever written. And I did a lot of classes on it. I did reading groups to get feedback. And when they told their friends and family about it, invariably the first question was, whose side is she on? With kind of a suspicious tone, you know, whose side is she on? And men really did tend to assume I was a male bashing feminist. And progressives did assume I was probably some angry defensive reactionary.
Yeah.
And what this study shows is you don't have to defend or attack masculinity wholesale. You really can support and affirm and encourage the good man. Encourage, you know, tap into that when you talk to men. You know, they don't respond well to being called toxic, surprisingly.
Yeah.
But you can tap into their own innate sense of what it means to be a good man. But we can think critically about the secular script that we might call the real man. You know, as Christians, we should think critically about that and maybe be aware if we're being drawn into it at all. So we're in a roundabout way, we've gotten back to what you were asking. Have Christians sometimes absorbed the secular script to some degree? Yeah, by seeing those two scripts, it helps us to maybe think more critically. Here's I just heard from a former graduate student of mine who now teaches high school. And she said, all my male students are into Andrew Tate. They even putting his quotes in their yearbook. She teaches at a classical Christian school.
Wow.
So that was a shock, you know, that even the Christian boys are being drawn into the Andrew Tate model. So it's important for us to really keep that distinction between the good man and the real man, which tends to be more of a cultural construct.
Yeah, that is so helpful. And I think, as we've mentioned, a man serving for the greater good. Well, if our society can't even define what good is, which you can ultimately apart from a consistent biblical worldview that understands its total truth, I think that's going to be difficult. And I love how you said a biblical masculinity looks like a man being the first to lead and to love and to serve. I think you were quoting another author on that too, and I think that's so key because related to your point of the different standards between men and women, I've seen a lot of women and mothers particularly have a rising interest in apologetics. You see the Mama Bear Apologetics. I've interviewed the founder, and she did a great job. But I've actually seen an odd, somewhat of a pushback on some men saying, well, that's not my field. That's almost the assumption. Maybe it's someone else's field in the family. Now, there's a lot of men in apologetics, but in the families, I've seen some husbands and men be like, that's not really as much my area. That's only those that are specialized that are. But then the assumption being that must be on the mother, I guess, but it's ignoring the mandate of the men and women to train the next generation is Deuteronomy 6. And I think like the first century and now, as you said, with many practical solutions, getting the fathers involved in the lives of their daughters and sons, well, that very much involves being the first to lead and training them in a biblical worldview and being present. And I really appreciated your discussion questions in the book and just your stories of people that are really figuring that out. At post-industrial evolution, we can figure it out. We have to figure it out. And I think that has to be part of our cultural apologetic moving forward. And there's so much more I wish we had time to talk through. But I just want to kind of wrap up our time here, just reminding our viewers and listeners to buy The Toxic War on Masculinity by Professor Pearcey. You can find it on Amazon or any of the major book distributors. And it's going to be well worth your time. And I guarantee you, every time you read it again, you're going to get more and more out of it because it's just so rich and just so well articulated. So again, thank you, Professor Pearcey, for your time. And I just really appreciate all your insights that you've shared with us today.
Thank you. It was good talking with you.